Hi, hello. So as we've seen, a lot of people are using open source. We also saw that open source is exploding. But we have a problem. And the problem is that we are still a bit limited in our skills as humans. We have a capacity to process data. So what we'll talk on these short slides is some techniques that you can use, really down to the level of the source code on how to start organizing these problems. So a bit about myself, a lot of introduction here. I also spent a good part of my time and expertise with a Linux Foundation, working on standardization, and with the Free Software Foundation. And Triple Check just develops tools to actually check the quality on these aspects. We have a problem with open source. Some companies, they try to use it or monetize it in a way that is a bit aggressive. While some other companies, they sometimes start creating some issues without knowing. And this happens because you're asking your engineers to go through millions of lines of code and then try to sort this on their own. And very honestly, it's quite easy to make a mistake. You have a deadline, you need to go to Stack Overflow, you get some code out of it, you just put it, you don't remember about it. But then the problem that you get out of this is if someone knocks in your door and says, well, excuse me, sir, but that's my code over there, can you please release the whole thing to me? And as a company manager or product owner, you'll say, this doesn't work. However, we also have the responsibility, since we are using open source, to start looking at open source from a product perspective. We have to start handling it more professionally. So intuitively, you will see a lot of companies doing something like this. They start by trying to organize all the components that they are using. Then they start trying to solve the license conflicts between them. So can a license work with another one? Is this compatible with what I want to do? And if you have some tooling, you start looking at the snippets. And in the end, you start creating the documentation. Creating the documentation in a way that the people that are receiving your code, your product, can actually understand it. And then probably, even the best case possible, to reuse this information. So most of you would probably start with an Excel file like this, where we try to discover which licenses we have in our code, or which parts of the code are ours, or which parts of the code from someone else. But in the end, this all boils down to the quality of the licenses that you have inside of it, and how well you're describing them. And this is what we try to help on this case, because it's fundamentally supported by three little things. One of them is your source code. The other one is the third-party code that you're using. But then in the end, it's also about the documentation. So how can people that are receiving your code understand what is inside of it? So if you are looking about the source code, it's relatively simple, but still forgotten, which is the headers. Marking the code as yours. Putting it saying, for example, this belongs to my company, and I'm making it available under this license. And if the code is proprietary, then just really put there proprietary. So when you are looking, for example, on the third-party code, it becomes much easier to know what was yours and what is theirs. But when you come down to listing your components, do you have a way to automate this list? Or is the person still doing it by hand? So these are the things that, if you're not doing them already, maybe you should start automating, like we saw before. And going back to the source code, it's relatively simple. So I would suggest just these two lines over there. And take notice of the second line where you see license, because many times you'll see just someone mentioning Apache or MIT or BSD, but this makes it a bit harder for the human that is receiving your code without any education or information to know that you're talking about a license and not a university. So try to make this kind of information easier for machines and humans to understand. Then we also have another way that we recommend, which is about files. This is just a small text file that you can use in Notepad. And on this text file, you describe things like the license that the component is under. You describe who wrote the components. You describe which files belong to that component or which folder. And it was first created by Android because they had to describe thousands of files and they had no way of doing it easily. But it's quite straightforward to go for it. So you can do it manually, but we also make a link over there for a free tool that you can just generate them. The other way that we recommend, it's actually a Linux Foundation initiative, already has some years. And what it does is for each file that you're giving in your zip file, it will describe the provenance of it, meaning the license, the copyright, and how you can use it. And it's also a very easy way for any machine or any tool from competitors or humans to pick up this information and then to reuse it. So if you are talking about fossology, for example, it will be able to reuse an SPDX. It's not possible to do it manually in most cases because it's many files, but we also make available a small tool for free that you can try it out and just create a few SPDXs. And then the last part that I would like to bring to your attention is the standardization. So one of the most important aspects is removing the ambiguity. So on this situation, putting the version number on a component is very important. So just saying that I'm using MySQL or something is not enough, because sometimes the license for that component changes over the years. So very important for us not to have to duplicate that effort. And I would also call your attention for SPDX org/licenses, because all the license names that you've been seeing across the day, they are using that standardization format. So they describe exactly how to write it in a very short way so that everyone is talking the same way about them. And then comes the last part, which is really looking at a source code. Let it be closed source, let it be open source. These 3 files, for example, they already tell us a lot about your project. So they can tell me, for example, which license terms are applicable. And not only do they do that, as they can also explain me, using a simple README, I know exactly where to find information about your project. A small summary, how I can use it, how I can contribute it, if I have a security disclaimer, how I can proceed to that. Well, I would also use a security MD. And these are information that most times when you are, even as a professional developer on a closed source project, you're not giving this information immediately, so it's not immediately intuitive for the person receiving the code. And the last thing that I would recommend personally that you start doing is an offer file, which is a way of saying which companies are writing the code for that given product, or the people that are involved there. And this is important because then it's the easiest way that we have to cross-match the information on the source code files and say, okay, this was built by this company or this person, but this one comes from another one. Even when the source code files from your company or someone else, they are very deeply mixed with one another. So this is one way of distinguishing them. And if it's a lot of work to create an offer file that for a project might have hundreds of people, we also make it easy to generate one. So if you're using GitHub, just run this type of syntax. And that's it. Very simple, very short. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Nuno. Great.